The autumn sun was setting over the quiet suburban neighborhood when Officer James Morrison's radio crackled to life. He had just finished his coffee break, sitting in his patrol car while watching kids play basketball at the local park. It was the kind of peaceful Sunday afternoon that usually meant an easy shift. Unit 247, we have a report of a disturbance at 1542 Maple Street. Neighbors report hearing screaming from inside the residence. Please respond. Morrison acknowledged the call, but something felt different this time. In his 15 years on the force, he'd responded to hundreds of disturbance calls, usually domestic disputes, rowdy teenagers, or the occasional drunk neighbor. But as he turned his patrol car towards Maple Street, an unexplainable unease settled in his stomach. The neighborhood was known for its historic homes, most built in the early 1900s. As Morrison drove down the tree-lined street, he noticed how the falling leaves created shadow patterns on the pavement. The house in question was a beautiful Victorian, painted in soft blue with white trim. At first glance, it looked perfectly normal, well-maintained flower beds, a porch swing moving gently in the breeze, and a wind chime tinkling softly. He parked his car and checked his notes. The call had come from number 1544, the house next door. An elderly woman stood on her porch, wringing her hands nervously as she watched him approach. "Officer, thank goodness you're here," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I've lived next door for 20 years, and I've never heard anything like that before." Morrison pulled out his notepad. "Can you tell me exactly what you heard, ma'am?" The woman hugged herself, despite the mild weather. "It started about an hour ago. At first, I thought it was the TV. You know how some people play their shows too loud. But then I heard it again. It wasn't just screaming, officer. It was different, like someone was terrified." As Morrison took notes, he asked about the neighbors. The elderly woman explained that a couple had bought the house 6 months ago. They seemed nice enough but kept to themselves. She'd only seen them a handful of times, usually leaving early in the morning or returning late at night. Morrison thanked her and walked toward the blue Victorian. The front yard was immaculate, almost too perfect, like a display home. No toys scattered about, no signs of daily life, just precise landscaping and carefully trimmed hedges. As he approached the front door, the unease in his stomach grew stronger. The porch creaked under his feet, and he noticed the curtains in the front window shift slightly. Was someone watching him? The wind chime's gentle melody now seemed eerie rather than peaceful. He pressed the doorbell and waited, listening intently. The house remained silent. No footsteps, no voices, not even the hum of a television or radio. He pressed it again, then knocked firmly on the door. "Police department. Anyone home?" That's when he noticed it. The door wasn't fully closed. There was a small gap, barely noticeable, but enough to show that the deadbolt hadn't caught properly. Whether it was left that way intentionally or by accident, Morrison couldn't tell. But after 15 years on the force, he'd learned that these small details often meant something much bigger. He reached for his radio to call for backup, his hand brushing against his service weapon, a habit born from years of experience. As he waited for dispatch to respond, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't going to be just another routine call. The perfect house, the nervous neighbor, the slightly open door, everything pointed to something being very wrong. The silence from within the house was deafening. No dog barking, no TV noise, not even the usual creaks and groans of an old house settling. It was as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for what would happen next. Morrison knew that in moments like these, seconds could mean the difference between life and death. As he waited for his backup to arrive, he kept his eyes on that slightly open door, wondering what secrets lay behind it. His years of experience told him that some of the worst crimes happened in the most beautiful places, behind the most perfect facades. Little did he know, this call would change not just his career, but his entire life. The picturesque Victorian house on Maple Street was about to reveal something that would haunt him forever. Backup was still 5 minutes out when Officer Morrison decided he couldn't wait any longer. The neighbor's description of the screams and that slightly open door demanded immediate action. He switched on his body camera and drew his flashlight, even though daylight still filtered through the trees. The porch steps creaked under his careful footsteps as he approached the front door. Up close, he noticed more details that seemed off. A small scuff mark on the doorframe. a single muddy footprint on the otherwise spotless welcome mat. The wind chime had stopped its gentle song, leaving an eerie silence. "Police department." Morrison called out again, his voice firm and professional. "I'm responding to a welfare check. Is anyone home?" The silence that answered him was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of a lawnmower somewhere down the street. Morrison's training kicked in automatically. He positioned himself to the side of the door, not directly in front of it. A habit that had saved officers' lives before. The gap in the doorway was wider from this angle, revealing a sliver of the entryway inside. The hardwood floors gleamed as if they'd just been polished. The interior of the house was dark despite the afternoon sun. Heavy curtains blocked most of the windows, creating deep shadows that his eyes struggled to penetrate. Morrison pulled out his flashlight, though he didn't switch it on yet. Years of experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, every one of them was screaming that something was wrong. He scanned the front of the house one more time. The upper windows stared back like empty eyes. A child's bicycle leaned against the garage, its chrome surfaces dulled by a thin layer of dust. It looked like it hadn't been used in weeks. Morrison keyed his radio, keeping his voice low. "Dispatch, Unit 247. I'm observing signs of possible forced entry. Door is unsecured. No response from occupants. I'm going to do a preliminary sweep of the residence." The dispatcher's voice crackled back. "Copy that, 247. Backup is 3 minutes out." With practiced movements, Morrison pushed the door open wider, wincing at the slight squeak of the hinges. The entryway opened into a formal living room on the left and a dining room on the right. Everything looked perfectly arranged, like a photo from a home decoration magazine. Too perfect. The air inside was different, stale, with an underlying scent he couldn't quite identify. It wasn't the usual smell of a lived-in home. No cooking odors, no laundry detergent, none of the normal scents of daily life. Instead, there was something chemical about it, like cleaning products used too liberally. His footsteps echoed slightly on the hardwood floors despite his careful movement. The living room looked like a museum display. Expensive furniture covered in plastic, photos arranged with geometric precision on the walls. But something caught his eye. One frame hung slightly crooked, as if it had been bumped recently. The dining room was equally pristine, with a table set for 4. The plates were covered in a fine layer of dust, suggesting no one had eaten there in quite some time. A child's homework assignment lay on one chair, the paper yellowed at the edges. The date at the top read 3 months ago. Morrison's pulse quickened. He'd seen houses like this before. Houses where people tried too hard to maintain an image of perfection. In his experience, that perfection usually hid something darker. A sound from deeper in the house made him freeze. It was faint, so faint he almost thought he'd imagined it. Like something being dragged across a floor or a door sliding shut. It came from somewhere beyond the kitchen. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the gaps in the curtains, creating dark patches that seemed to move with each slight breeze. Morrison reached for his radio again, intending to update dispatch when something else caught his eye. A fresh scratch on the baseboard, about knee-height, leading toward the kitchen. The white paint was scraped away, revealing raw wood underneath. It looked recent. His training told him to wait for backup, but his instincts told him time was critical. Someone could be hurt, needing immediate help. He took another step forward, then another, moving deeper into the house. The perfectly arranged furniture and spotless surfaces felt more menacing with each passing moment. The scratch marks continued, a trail leading him forward. They told the story. Someone or something had been dragged through this house recently enough that the marks hadn't been painted over or cleaned away. In a house this meticulously maintained, that fact alone spoke volumes. The kitchen doorway loomed ahead, and beyond it, darkness waited. Morrison's hand tightened on his flashlight. In 15 years of police work, he'd learned that some of the worst crimes happened in the nicest neighborhoods, behind the most carefully maintained facades. But something told him that what waited in this house would be unlike anything he'd encountered before. The perfectly maintained Victorian, with its pristine lawn and carefully arranged interiors, was about to reveal its secrets. And Officer Morrison, standing in that shadowy hallway, was about to discover that sometimes the most frightening things hide in plain sight behind a mask of suburban perfection. The kitchen doorway seemed to grow darker as Officer Morrison approached. His flashlight beam cut through the shadows, revealing a scene that stopped him in his tracks. The kitchen, like the rest of the house, was immaculate, but something was very wrong. A chair lay on its side near the kitchen island, the only thing out of place in the otherwise perfect room. Next to it, a glass of water sat half-finished on the counter, condensation still beading on its surface. Someone had been here recently. "Police department," Morrison called out again, his voice echoing off the spotless appliances. "If anyone's here, make yourself known." Only silence answered him. The kitchen told its own story. A pot of coffee sat cold in an expensive coffee maker, the liquid inside dark and stale. Mail was stacked neatly on the counter, the top envelope postmarked 3 days ago. The refrigerator hummed softly, covered in children's artwork and family photos held by colorful magnets. Morrison studied the photos carefully. They showed a family, parents and 2 children, smiling at the camera. Recent pictures, judging by the clothes and quality. But something about their smiles seemed forced, especially in the most recent ones. The kind of smiles people wear when they're trying to convince the world everything is fine. A school calendar hung nearby, marked with activities and appointments. The last entry was from 2 days ago, Parent-Teacher Conference. It was circled in red ink. Morrison made a mental note to check with the school later. The scratch marks he'd noticed in the hallway continued across the kitchen floor, leading toward a door in the far corner. Unlike the rest of the house's pristine woodwork, this door showed signs of wear. The paint around the handle was worn away, and the bottom edge was scuffed and dented. Morrison's radio crackled softly. "Unit 247, backup is 1 minute out. What's your status?" He kept his voice low as he responded. "Inside the residence. Kitchen area. Signs of recent activity. Possible disturbance." He didn't mention the growing knot in his stomach, the feeling that something was terribly wrong here. A sudden noise from behind the worn door made him freeze. It was supple, just a soft thud, like something heavy being moved, or someone trying to move quietly. Morrison approached the door carefully, noting how the temperature seemed to drop with each step. His training kicked in automatically. Angle of approach, weapon ready but not drawn, flashlight positioned for maximum visibility while maintaining control. The door handle felt cold under his touch. He tested it gently, unlocked. The hinges creaked slightly as he eased it open, revealing a set of stairs leading down into darkness. The basement. Of course it would be the basement. The air that drifted up from below was damp and carried that same chemical smell he'd noticed earlier, stronger now. His flashlight beam revealed more scratch marks on the walls of the stairwell, some old, some disturbingly fresh. Standard procedure would be to wait for backup now. Clear the upper floor first, establish a perimeter, then methodically search the basement. But another sound drifted up from below, so faint he almost missed it. A whimper, quickly muffled. Someone was down there, someone who needed help. Morrison took his first step onto the stairs, wincing at the slight creak under his foot. The darkness seemed to swallow his flashlight beam, the shadows growing deeper with each step. The walls closed in tighter than seemed normal for a house this size, making the descent feel claustrophobic. Behind him, he could hear the faint sounds of his backup arriving outside. Their radios crackled distantly, voices muffled by the walls of the house. Help was here, but they felt a world away from this narrow stairwell and whatever waited at the bottom. The temperature continued to drop as he descended. His breath began to fog in the beam of his flashlight. Another step, another creak. The chemical smell grew stronger, mixing with something else, something that made his police instinct scream in warning. Halfway down, his flashlight beam caught something on the wall, writing, scratched into the paint. Numbers, maybe dates. Some were crossed out. The most recent looked like it was from yesterday. The whimper came again, clearer now. Definitely human, definitely afraid. Morrison reached the bottom of the stairs, his flashlight revealing a sight that would stay with him forever. The basement opened up before him, but this was no ordinary cellar. What he saw in those first few seconds would change everything, not just this case, but his entire understanding of what humans were capable of. The scratches on the walls, the fake smiles in the photos, the perfectly maintained facade upstairs. It all made terrible sense now, as Officer Morrison stood at the bottom of those stairs, his flashlight beam revealing the truth behind the peaceful suburban home's dark secret. But even his 15 years of police work hadn't prepared him for what he found in that basement. Sometimes the most horrifying discoveries aren't about what you see. They're about what you realize has been happening right under your feet in the quiet houses on peaceful streets where everyone assumes nothing bad could ever happen. The basement's darkness seemed to press in from all sides as Officer Morrison's flashlight beam cut through the gloom. The first thing that caught his attention was the stark contrast to the perfect house above. Here, the walls were bare concrete and the floor was rough and unfinished. His beam swept across scattered evidence of a struggle. A broken chair lay in one corner, one of its legs splintered. Papers were strewn across the floor, what looked like children's homework assignments and family photos, torn and crumpled. A child's backpack sat abandoned near a support pillar, its contents spilled out as if dropped in a hurry. The family photos on the refrigerator upstairs suddenly took on a new chilling meaning. Morrison picked up one of the scattered photos from the floor. It showed the same family, but this one was different from those displayed above. Here, the smiles were genuine, relaxed, a snapshot of happier times before whatever darkness had descended on this house. A noise drew his attention to the far corner. His light revealed a heavy metal door, the kind you might find in a storm shelter. It looked out of place, too new and too solid compared to the rest of the basement. Fresh scratch marks scarred the concrete floor in front of it. "Police," Morrison called out again. "If someone's here, make a sound." The response was immediate, a muffled thumping from behind the metal door. Morrison approached carefully, noting the sophisticated electronic lock mounted beside it. This was no ordinary storm shelter. His radio crackled with the voices of backup officers entering the house above. Morrison keyed his radio, keeping his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Basement level. I need additional units down here now. Possible victims located." The thumping grew more insistent. Morrison reached the door, noting how the air grew colder as he approached. The chemical smell was strongest here, mixed with the musty scent of damp concrete and something else: fear. His flashlight beam revealed more numbers scratched into the wall beside the door. Dates, times, carefully recorded. The most recent was from just hours ago. Below them were other marks, 5 parallel lines crossed by a diagonal, counting days. The family photos scattered on the floor told a story that made his blood run cold. In the earliest ones, they were happy, natural. But as the dates progressed, the smiles became forced, the eyes showed fear. The last photo was dated just last week. Only the children appeared in it, their expressions haunted. Morrison's backup arrived at the top of the stairs, their flashlight beams joining his in the darkness. He could hear them making their way down, each step creaking under their weight. "Over here," he called to them. "We've got a secured door, possible victims inside." His light swept the area again, revealing more details. A desk pushed against one wall held a laptop and several notebooks. Case files? Records? The implications made his stomach turn. The thumping had stopped, replaced by what sounded like crying. Not the loud, dramatic sobs you hear in movies, but the quiet, exhausted weeping of someone who's been crying for a very long time. One of the backup officers reached for the electronic lock, but Morrison stopped him. "Wait," he said, picking up one of the notebooks from the desk. "We need to do this right. Everything here is evidence." He opened the notebook, his flashlight illuminating pages of handwritten notes. Dates, times, observations, all recorded in meticulous detail. The kind of records that would make any detective's job easier, while making their skin crawl. The crying continued softly from behind the door. Morrison knew that what they found in this basement would haunt the dreams of everyone involved for years to come. But right now, someone needed help. Someone had been waiting for far too long. As his fellow officers called for detectives and crime scene units, Morrison studied the door lock more closely. The electronic keypad glowed faintly in the darkness, its buttons worn from frequent use. Someone had maintained this setup carefully, methodically. The perfect house above had been a facade, hiding this nightmare beneath. The notebook in his hands would help them understand what had happened here, but Morrison already knew one thing for certain. This case would change him forever. Sometimes the worst monsters aren't the ones that hide under beds or in closets. Sometimes they're the ones who maintain perfect lawns and wave to their neighbors while keeping their darkest secrets locked away in basement rooms with electronic doors. The backup officers secured the scene as Morrison prepared to open the door. Whatever waited on the other side would reveal the true horror of what had been happening in this seemingly perfect suburban home. But first, they had to get that door open and face whatever darkness lay behind it. The electronic lock beeped softly as the forensics team worked to bypass it. Officer Morrison stood ready with 2 other officers, their flashlights trained on the heavy metal door. The basement air had grown colder, or maybe it was just the tension making everyone shiver. "Got it," the tech whispered it as the lock clicked. The sound echoed in the basement like a gunshot. Morrison took a deep breath. "Police department, we're coming in," he announced firmly. "Please stay calm. We're here to help." The door swung open with a hydraulic hiss, revealing a narrow corridor that shouldn't have existed in a normal house's foundation. Their flashlight beams showed walls lined with sound-dampening material. No wonder nobody had heard anything from outside. The corridor led to another room, larger than expected. As their lights swept across it, the officers fell silent. The room was set up like a twisted version of a classroom. Small desks were arranged in neat rows. Educational posters covered the walls, but they were old and yellowed. A whiteboard still showed math problems, the writing faded but legible. "Clear the room," Morrison ordered, his voice tight. The officers moved methodically, checking every corner, every possible hiding space. But the room held only empty chairs and abandoned schoolwork. Then Morrison's light caught something. A slight irregularity in the wall paneling. He approached carefully, running his hand along the edge. There was airflow, a draft. "Over here," he called quietly. The other officers converged on his position as he found the hidden latch. Another door, cleverly concealed within the wall panels. This one opened easier, revealing what looked like a living space. Bunk beds. A small bathroom. Everything was clean but worn, used. On a small table, a plate of food sat untouched, the bread dried and stale. The officers spread out, documenting everything with their body cameras. Morrison's light revealed more disturbing details, a calendar on the wall marked with countless X's, a collection of worn children's books, clothes folded neatly on shelves. A sudden noise from behind a partition made everyone freeze. Morrison raised his hand, signaling the others to hold position. "This is the police," he said gently. "You're safe now. Please come out slowly if you can." Silence. Then a shuffling sound. "It's okay," Morrison continued, keeping his voice calm despite his racing heart. "Nobody's going to hurt you. We're here to help." A small figure emerged from behind the partition. A child, no more than 12, blinking in the flashlight beams. Behind them, another child, younger. Their faces were pale from lack of sunlight, but their eyes held a mix of fear and desperate hope. Morrison holstered his weapon immediately. "You're safe now," he repeated, kneeling to their level. "We're going to get you out of here." The children didn't speak. The older one simply pointed to another hidden door, this one at floor level. Morrison's blood ran cold as he realized what it might mean. The forensics team worked on this lock while paramedics tended to the children. When it finally opened, they found a room filled with filing cabinets and computers. Records. Years of them. The implications made Morrison's stomach turn. But there was something else. A final door, heavily reinforced. As they approached, they could hear movement behind it. Someone was still here, waiting to be found. Morrison keyed his radio. "Dispatch, we need additional units and medical personnel. Multiple victims located." His voice remained professional, but his hands shook slightly as he lowered the radio. The last door was the hardest to open. When it finally yielded, what they found inside would become part of police training manuals for years to come. Not because of its horror, though there was plenty of that, but because of the resilience of the human spirit they discovered. The room held answers to the questions raised by the scratch marks upstairs, the dates on the walls, the forced smiles in those family photos. But more importantly, it held survivors. People who had endured the unthinkable and lived to see this day of rescue. As Morrison helped coordinate the evacuation, he knew this case would change not just his career, but his entire worldview. The perfect house above had hidden so much pain below, But today, that pain would end. Today, people who had lived in darkness would finally see the light again. The basement had revealed its secrets, but the real work was just beginning. Helping these survivors heal would take time, patience, and resources. But looking at their faces as they were led to safety, Morrison saw something he hadn't expected: hope. Sometimes the darkest places hide the strongest spirits, and sometimes the most important police work isn't about catching bad guys, it's about being there when someone needs you most, about bringing light to places where darkness has ruled for far too long. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of activity. The quiet Victorian house on Maple Street had transformed into a full crime scene, with police cars and news vans lining the street. Officer Morrison watched from his position near the front door as forensics teams came and went, carrying evidence boxes and taking photographs. He hadn't gone home yet. Couldn't. Every time he tried to leave, the faces of those he found in the basement pulled him back. He'd stayed through the night, helping process the scene, giving statements, doing whatever was needed to keep his mind occupied. The morning sun cast long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn. Neighbors gathered behind the yellow police tape, whispering among themselves. How had they not known? How had nobody noticed? The questions echoed Morrison's own thoughts. Inside, the house told a different story in daylight. The pristine surfaces and carefully arranged furniture now seemed sinister rather than sophisticated. Every perfect detail felt like a deliberate distraction designed to keep people from looking too closely. Morrison sat at his desk in the station later that day, staring at the preliminary report. The words swam before his tired eyes. 36 hours without sleep was catching up to him, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw that basement classroom, those marking on the walls, those haunted faces. "You need to go home," his surgeon said, placing a cup of coffee on his desk. "You've done everything you can for now." But Morrison shook his head. "I need to finish this," he said, gesturing to the report, "while it's still fresh." The surgeon understood. Every officer had that one case that got under their skin, that changed them fundamentally. This was Morrison's. The evidence they'd gathered painted a picture that grew darker with each new detail. The filing cabinets in the basement had contained records going back years. The computers held more information, carefully organized and documented. The scope of what they'd uncovered was still expanding. Morrison's phone buzzed with a text from his wife, asking if he was okay. He hadn't told her the details yet, couldn't find the words to describe what he'd seen. How do you explain to someone that the world is different now? That you can't look at a perfect house on a quiet street the same way again? The children they'd rescued were safe now, receiving medical care and counseling. Morrison had visited them briefly at the hospital, bringing them some books and toys. They hadn't spoken much, but their eyes had lit up at the gifts, small moments of joy in the aftermath of darkness. As evening approached, Morrison finally agreed to take a break. He walked to the station's break room, his movements stiff from sitting too long. The TV was on, showing news coverage of the case. The reporter stood in front of the blue Victorian, talking about a shocking discovery and ongoing investigation. Morrison turned away. They didn't know the half of it. Couldn't know. Some details would never make it to the news, would stay forever in police reports and witness statements, haunting the dreams of those who had seen them firsthand. Back at his desk, he opened his drawer and pulled out a business card. The department's counselor had given it to him earlier that day. "When you're ready," she'd said. Morrison had seen too many good officers try to handle trauma alone. He wouldn't make that mistake. The night shift was starting, bringing fresh energy to the station. Morrison watched his colleagues arrive, their faces showing concern when they saw him still at his desk. Word had spread about what they'd found in that basement. Everyone knew this case was different. His surgeon appeared again, this time with car keys. "I'm driving you home," she said firmly. "No arguments. You need rest." As they drove through the darkening streets, Morrison found himself studying each house they passed. Perfect lawns, neat gardens, carefully maintained facades. How many other secrets lay hidden behind ordinary doors? How many other basements held darkness? But he also thought about the survivors, their strength, their resilience. He thought about the moment they realized help had finally arrived, the look in their eyes when they saw his flashlight beam cutting through their darkness. That's what he would hold on to, he decided. Not the horror of what he'd discovered, but the fact that he'd been there to help end it. That's what would get him through the nightmares he knew were coming. Tomorrow would bring more investigation, more questions, more pieces of the puzzle to fit together. But for now, Morrison let his sergeant drive him home, where his wife waited with open arms and a warmth that would help chase away the basement's lingering chill. Sometimes the hardest part of being a police officer isn't what you find. It's learning to live with what you found, learning to carry the weight of knowledge while still doing your job, still believing in goodness despite seeing the worst humanity has to offer. 6 months had passed since that fateful day at the Victorian house. The seasons had changed, leaves had fallen, and snow now covered the perfectly manicured lawn. The house stood empty now, its windows dark, waiting for new owners who didn't know its history. Officer Morrison sat in his patrol car parked across the street. He didn't plan to stop here. His feet just seemed to bring him back sometimes, like they had their own memory of that day. The therapist said this was normal, part of processing what had happened. His radio crackled with routine calls, but his mind wandered to the changes the past months had brought. He transferred to the department's Special Victims Unit, working cases that once would have seemed beyond imagination. The basement had changed him, but not in a way he'd feared. Instead of breaking him, it had given him purpose. The survivors were doing better now. He kept in touch through proper channels, watching their progress from a professional distance. The children were back in school, real school this time, with sunlight and friends and everything kids should have. Their resilience amazed him daily. Morrison pulled out his notebook, the same one he carried that day. Its pages were filled with his handwriting, documenting everything from that case. But the last few pages held something different, notes for the training program he'd developed. Hidden in plain sight, he called it, teaching other officers what to look for, how to spot the signs he'd missed at first. The court case had concluded last week. Justice had been served, though Morrison knew no sentence could truly make up for what had happened in that basement. Still, watching the survivors testify had filled him with pride. Their courage in facing their fears had inspired everyone in the courtroom. His phone buzzed, a text from his wife reminding him about dinner. She'd been his rock through everything, listening when he needed to talk, staying silent when he needed space. The nightmares came less frequently now, replaced by dreams of rescue and recovery. As Morrison started his car, he noticed someone standing at the house next door, the elderly neighbor who'd made the original call. She waved, and he rolled down his window. "I'm selling my house," she said softly. "Can't live here anymore. Keep thinking about what was happening right next door all that time." Morrison nodded. He understood. The weight of knowing could be heavy. "You did the right thing," he told her. "You made that call. You helped save them." She smiled sadly. "So did you, officer. So did you." Back at the station, Morrison's desk looked different now. Photos of successful rescues shared space with commendations. A child's drawing hung in a frame, stick figures in the sun, with a blue figure wearing a badge. "Thank you" written in crayon across the top. His sergeant dropped a new case file on his desk. "Think you should handle this one," she said. Another house, another quiet street. But this time, Morrison knew what to look for. This time, he might spot the signs sooner. The training program he developed was making a difference. Officers in other districts had started using it, learning to see beyond perfect facades and manicured lawns, learning that sometimes the worst crimes hide behind the most normal appearances. As Morrison opened the new case file, he thought about how much had changed. The nightmares had faded, replaced by determination. Every case was a chance to prevent another basement, to save someone before years slipped away. His phone buzzed again. A message from the department counselor checking in. He smiled as he typed his response. "Doing good, really good." And for the first time in months, he meant it completely. The Victorian house had taught him something vital, that darkness can hide anywhere, but so can hope. That sometimes the most important victories come not from preventing tragedy, but from being there when someone needs help the most. Morrison gathered his things, ready to head home for dinner. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new challenges. But he was ready for them now, changed but not broken by what he'd seen. Sometimes the worst moments in life lead us to our true purpose. For Morrison, that purpose was clear, making sure no basement stayed dark forever, no cry for help went unheard. As he drove home through the quiet streets, Morrison knew he'd never see the world quite the same way again. But maybe that was okay. Maybe seeing the darkness more clearly helped him better appreciate the light. The end of this case had become the beginning of something else, a new chapter in his career, a new way of helping people. And somewhere out there, survivors were sleeping safely tonight because someone had cared enough to look deeper, to see past the perfect surface to the truth that lay beneath.